You have been watching a CBS News special report on the Senate confirmation of the next Associate Justice of the Supreme Court, Judge Neil Gorsuch. Let's bring in Ilya Shapiro. He is editor-in-chief of the Cato Institute Supreme Court Review. He's with us from Washington, D.C. via Skype. All right, Ilya, so talk about the impact of Judge Gorsuch's confirmation. In other words, this has been a seat that has been vacant. It doesn't really change the balance of the court from when Scalia was there, but how do you see it moving forward?
Well, first thing, this seems like a momentous week. Indeed, anytime there's a new justice confirmed, it's a big deal. But both this type of justice being selected and confirmed, and the exercise of the nuclear option, getting rid of the filibuster for Supreme Court nominees, that was all predictable once Donald Trump won the election, the way the politics were shaping up. What this means for the future of the court, as Jan Crawford said during the special report, is that Scalia, a conservative, kind of on the right side of the court, will be replaced by someone like him in many ways. There will obviously be differences. No two justices are alike, but on all of the kind of major controversial cases that split 5-4, where Scalia was in the majority, Gorsuch is expected to be in the majority, whether that's gun rights or campaign finance, other controversial issues, federalism, Obamacare, what have you, and where Scalia was in the minority, in dissent, presumably Gorsuch would be there as well. So going forward, not a drastic shift as would have happened if Hillary Clinton had been selecting this nominee, this next justice, or potentially for the next vacancy if Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who's 84, or Anthony Kennedy, the swing vote, who's 80 going on 81. That's really where the court would shift.
All right, so lay out the timeline for us moving forward. When will Gorsuch begin hearing cases, and what specific cases should we be watching out for?
Right. Well, the White House has announced, in fact, there's an official press release from the Supreme Court as well, that on Monday morning at 9 a.m., Gorsuch will be sworn in by the Chief Justice at the Supreme Court. And he starts in right away. I'm sure he's already been boning up on a lot of the briefing for the cases that, for oral argument, that start the following week, April 17th. There are about a dozen, I think, or maybe a slightly fewer, 8 maybe, cases that are left to be heard this term. He will participate in those. Traditionally, he will not be participating in cases that have already been heard, even if they haven't been decided. It could be that some of those cases will be set for re-argument either later this term or starting in the fall, if they split 4-4 and the court would rather Gorsuch participate.
Ilya, I want to ask you about something that I think is sort of interesting when we look at the history of the Supreme Court in the United States. I'm sure you're familiar with the Martin Quinn score, and there was a report out by 538, the blog, headed up by Nate Silver, that in many cases, some justices become a little bit more liberal as they age. Are you seeing that, and is that something that you can see going forward? And if so, who would that, if you had to pick a justice who would maybe swing a little bit more to the left than he might have had as a young man or a young woman, what do you think? Who do you think that would be?
I think that used to be the case. I don't think that's the case anymore. As organizations like the Federalist Society, libertarian and conservative lawyers group who has helped President Trump put out his list from which he picked Neil Gorsuch, as these types of organizations that are more focused on judicial philosophy rather than just being loyal party men and women, say, as would happen in the past. I don't think you're going to ever see again, really, unless something unexpected happens, a David Souter or a John Paul Stevens, Republican nominees who certainly moved left while they were on the court. Some people said that Kennedy has moved left in certain ways. I think he's always been kind of idiosyncratic and moderate and quasi-libertarian in certain ways. I don't really expect any of the current justices to have a pronounced effect in that manner. John Roberts obviously joined with the liberals on the 2 Obamacare cases, but shows no indication that he's not conservative in other ways. That's kind of a different debate about judicial restraint versus originalism or engagement. So I would expect Gorsuch to continue being the same kind of jurist that he's shown that he's been on the 10th Circuit.
All right, so in the lead up to this vote, we heard senators on both sides of the aisle express some serious concerns about the long-term impact of the rule change. In fact, what we didn't really know, but we came to learn, is that this is pretty historic, this implementation of the nuclear option. Can you talk to us a little bit about the long-term implications?
I would actually say it's not that historic. It restores the status quo of what was effectively in place until about 15 years ago. There had been no partisan filibusters of judicial nominees until the Democrats started pushing back on some of George Bush's lower court nominees in 2003, 2004, and there's been a ratcheting up of tensions ever since. Of course, Harry Reid removed the filibuster for lower court nominees 4 years ago. Then last year, Mitch McConnell and the Republicans didn't even take up Merrick Garland, and now you have the removal of the filibuster for Supreme Court nominees. So for practical purposes, this restores the Senate tradition of anyone having majority support being confirmed, like Clarence Thomas, who was confirmed 52-48, or Justice Alito, Sam Alito, was confirmed 58-42.
So, Ilya, Judge Gorsuch, as you know, we've been discussing, is set to replace Antonin Scalia. He was the most conservative, or one of the most conservative members of the bench. And you heard Jan mention this in her hit on the CBS News special report, right? Justice Anthony Kennedy is expected to retire in the next year or two. He's a little bit more moderate. A lot of people are expressing surprise that the Democrats didn't hold off on perhaps the next Supreme Court justice to leave the court, in this case, possibly Kennedy. So how might this rule change impact that next nomination process?
Right. Not that I'd be the one that Democrats would be listening to on Senate strategy, but it does seem like Chuck Schumer was between a rock and a hard place. The base was obviously crying for blood after the election and after holding not taking up Merrick Garland. But strategically, as you allude, removing or pushing the Republicans to eliminate the filibuster now means that indeed, if and when Kennedy retires, whether it's next year or whenever, or Ruth Bader Ginsburg or Stephen Breyer, who's also getting up there in years, he's 78, the Democrats will not have that tool, and so the question of whether, say, a Susan Collins or a Lindsey Graham, some of the more moderate Republicans on judicial issues, whether they might not have voted to get rid of the filibuster on a different nominee in that circumstance. But here, if Neil Gorsuch is subject to filibuster, then anybody would effectively, and the Democrats allowed much easier for the Republicans to get together on this. And as you say, the next vacancy will make it harder for the Democrats to resist. We'll see what whether they regret their votes at this point.